feel so passionate about boys and men. Where did that come from?
It came from a mixture of the social scientist and the dad. So the social scientist in me, as I was at Brookings for 10 years and doing work on inequality, education, mobility, all gaps. I've always been about what's stopping people from rising and flourishing. That's really the through line of all my work in politics and scholarship. And I just kept seeing these data points. I just kept seeing these data points showing the gaps in education now, the much higher rates of suicide, just the deaths of despair. So there was all this evidence that on a lot of fronts, a lot of boys and men are really not doing very well. In some ways, relatively speaking, compared to how women and girls are doing on those fronts. And sometimes, absolutely speaking, just getting worse off. And so kept seeing these papers, I kept seeing these numbers, and then I'd look around and see who was talking about this, who was doing the work on this, what was the debate about this, and found it really lacking. I found it very political, very partisan, not very fact-based, and it was almost like people would say privately, oh yeah, everyone knows, of course, that being male is the biggest risk of dropping out of college. Everyone knows that there's a 4 times higher suicide rate than men. Like everyone knows that male wages are falling. Actually, I don't know if everyone does know that. And I'm not sure that should just be a passing comment. And then as a dad, I've raised 3 boys on both sides of the Atlantic, and they're all in their 20s now. And whilst they are privileged, to use your term, in almost every imaginable way, nonetheless, the conversations about masculinity, dating, life, patriarchy, etc., was like dinner table conversation. And so, and in the end, those two things came together as both a dad and a social scientist. But the big reason is that I felt that the public conversation about boys and men was a pretty low quality, and that maybe I could help just notch it up a little bit with, facts and evaluation, and most importantly, a genuinely non-partisan approach to this. I felt that the whole way it was becoming framed as zero sum. And I just found so many people afraid to even talk about it. That's the bad position to be in. So
that's the thing, isn't it? And for men feeling as though if they do speak out in any kind of sense, that it's going to be branded toxic. And I've seen you talk about toxic masculinity before, but do you think for the listeners, you could just maybe define toxic masculinity and basically how it's evolved?
Well, I can't define toxic masculinity. I think it's incumbent on the users of the term to define it. And one of the reasons that I've come to believe that it is such an unhelpful term is the failure to come up with a plausible definition. And I think the term, to be clear, I think the term toxic masculinity is itself toxic. Mm. And that's not what I thought coming into this conversation. But what people seem to mean by it is expressions, behavior that is typically associated with men and or masculinity that is clearly antisocial, that's clearly bad, in some cases very bad, and in some way is related to ideas of masculinity, right? That's really the best people can do about it. The term actually evolved from the study of prisoners and a very small group of very violent criminals, men, for whom actually their sense of how to be a man had become quite entwined with violence, especially. And so before 2016, the term toxic masculinity appeared about 5 times a year in obscure academic journals in this very, very narrow way to look at this very small group of men. And then it became part of the general discourse, and suddenly it was used to explain climate change, the recession, boys making passes at girls. And in my own personal case, it was the term that was used to describe the behavior of a boy at the high school my kids went to when he and some mates made a list of girls that they fancied. And then a girl saw it, right? And that was toxic masculinity. It got international press attention. The American Psychological Association, who I should say are really moving on this issue now, but they got into real trouble because they couldn't really, they talked about traditional masculinity ideology. There are 2 big problems with toxic masculinity. One is the just practical one, is it drives men away from the conversation. There are very few boys and men who want to have a conversation about which bits of them are toxic and which bits of them are not toxic. There are very few people who are inspired by the goal of becoming not poisonous, right? All right, it's not a very aspirational goal. And the second problem is an intellectual one, which is that everybody who uses the term cannot define non-toxic masculinity in a way that's distinct from femininity. If you ask them, okay, so what's non-toxic masculinity then? They'll say, well, nurturing and caring and being emotionally available and vulnerable. Okay, isn't that stereotypical femininity? How is that different from femininity? They say, oh, it isn't, it's the same.